The crystal chandeliers of the Astoria Grand trembled as Celeste Ashford Vance laughed one syllable too loud. "She's not your type, darling. Look at her. She's the entertainment, not a guest." The champagne flute in her manicured hand caught the light like a blade. Across the ballroom, seated at the ivory Steinway, Rosalind Marchetti did not stop playing. But a single tear fell onto the D-sharp key and rolled silently between the ivories. What Celeste didn't know, what nobody in that gilded room understood yet, was that Raphael De Luca had heard every word. And Raphael De Luca did not forgive cruelty. By the time the clock struck midnight, 3 careers would be quietly buried. 1 engagement would shatter across the marble floor, and the woman everyone had mocked would walk out of that ballroom on the arm of the most dangerous man in New York. Because nobody, absolutely nobody, insults the woman he has already chosen. The Astoria Grand Ballroom sat perched on the 73rd floor of a limestone tower on the Upper East Side, a temple of old money where reservations were secured through bloodlines rather than bank accounts. The air inside always carried the same intoxicating cocktail, aged Macallan, imported white peonies, and the faint metallic tang of wealth so old it had begun to rust. Waiters in white gloves glided between guests carrying flutes of Dom Perignon 2008. A 20-piece orchestra performed on a raised dais draped in midnight velvet. The floor was Carrara marble veined with real gold. Beneath a domed ceiling painted with a Renaissance replica of the Sistine, 300 of Manhattan's most powerful people gathered for the annual Ashford Foundation Winter Benefit, an event whose guest list was policed more tightly than any government secret. Senators mingled with hedge fund heirs. European countesses air-kissed with tech billionaires. Every woman in the room wore Valentino, Oscar de la Renta, or Elie Saab. Every man wore Brioni or Tom Ford. And every single one of them, without exception, believed they belonged there. Rosalind Marchetti was the only person in the entire ballroom who did not. She had arrived through the service entrance at 6 in the evening, carrying a garment bag containing a plum-colored dress she had bought secondhand from a consignment shop in Astoria. At 27 years old, standing 5'5" and carrying a soft, generous figure that the fashion world had spent decades trying to erase, Rosie had learned to move through spaces like these the way a librarian moved through a museum, quietly, respectfully, invisibly. Her dark chestnut hair was twisted into a low chignon at the nape of her neck. Her makeup was simple. Her only jewelry was a small gold cross that had belonged to her grandmother. She had been hired to play background piano during the cocktail hour and dinner service, a role that paid $700 for the evening, an amount that would cover exactly half of her mother's monthly bill at the memory care facility in Rego Park. Her younger brother Danny, who had cerebral palsy, needed a new communication device that cost $4,000 she did not have. Her father had died 3 years earlier, leaving behind gambling debts she was still quietly paying. And yet, when Rosie sat down at the Steinway and rested her hands on the keys, none of that existed. She had been a Juilliard Scholarship recipient once, before her father's death forced her to withdraw 2 weeks into her second year. She had not touched a concert-grade instrument in almost 30 months. When her fingers pressed the first chord of Debussy's Clair de Lune, something inside her that had been holding its breath for years finally exhaled. The event coordinator, a rail-thin woman named Prudence with a headset and a permanent scowl, had already snapped at her twice, once for using the wrong staircase, once for asking where she could get a glass of water. "You're not a guest, Marchetti. You're a service provider. Don't make eye contact with anyone. Don't speak unless spoken to. And for God's sake, do not eat anything from the past trays." Rosie had nodded, kept her chin down, and returned to the piano. She had grown accustomed over the years to a certain kind of cruelty that dressed itself in professionalism. It was almost easier than the other kinds. What she did not yet know was that the man who had upended her entire life was already stepping out of a black armored Bentley at the tower's private entrance, and the tremor that would soon run through the ballroom had already begun. At precisely 8:30 in the evening, the mahogany doors of the Astoria Grand swung open, and the ambient hum of the ballroom collapsed into a stunned, involuntary silence. The orchestra faltered on a single measure of Vivaldi before recovering. Waiters froze mid-pour. A hedge fund heiress laughing near the ice sculpture caught the sudden hush and turned, still smiling, before her smile died on her face. Raphael De Luca had arrived. He was 35 years old, 6'3", and carved from a discipline that most men in the room had never known. His bespoke midnight blue suit had been hand-stitched in Naples by a tailor whose client list was shorter than a papal audience. His dark hair was cut severely, his jaw was clean-shaven, and his eyes, a color so dark they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, swept across the ballroom with the flat, patient attention of a predator counting exits. Flanking him were two men. To his left was Marco Ricci, his consigliere, silver-haired and reading everything through wire-rimmed glasses. To his right was Salvatore Sal Greco, 6'6" of pure violence in a tuxedo, his hands folded before him in the posture of a man who could break a spine before the orchestra finished a bar. Raphael De Luca did not appear in newspapers. His name was not spoken above a whisper in the corridors of the Manhattan District Attorney's office. The De Luca family had, over 3 generations, quietly consolidated control of the East Coast ports from Baltimore to Boston, and Raphael, since inheriting his father's seat at 29, had modernized the operation with the ruthless efficiency of a Fortune 500 CEO. He owned judges. He owned senators' mistresses. He owned the discreet trucking companies that moved things nobody talked about. And he was attending the Ashford Foundation Winter Benefit because the De Luca Family Foundation, an entirely legitimate philanthropic entity that funded pediatric oncology research at Sloan Kettering, was the evening's largest donor. He hated these events. He hated the perfume, the performative kindness, the daughters of oil executives who threw themselves at him with the subtlety of falling anvils. He had promised his mother, Sophia, that he would appear for exactly 90 minutes and no longer. And he was already 7 minutes in, counting the seconds until he could leave. Then he heard the piano. It was not the piece that stopped him. It was the way it was being played. Someone in this room of professional pretenders was making Debussy sound like a prayer whispered into a dying candle. Raphael turned his head slowly, ignoring the senator's wife who had just angled herself into his eye line with a practiced smile, and looked across the ballroom toward the raised dais where the Steinway sat. The pianist's back was to him. All he could see was the curve of her shoulders, the soft slope of her waist, the dark chestnut hair coiled neatly at her neck. She was not thin. She was not fashionable. She was, by every metric this ballroom worshipped, invisible. And she was, without any question, the only genuinely beautiful thing in the room. He watched her for the length of the entire piece. He did not speak. He did not move. Marco Ricci, beside him, exchanged a single silent glance with Sal Greco. In 15 years of working for Raphael De Luca, neither of them had ever seen him look at a woman for longer than 3 seconds without eventually losing interest. He had now been staring for 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Something they both understood without saying a word had just changed. Before I go any further, if you're already feeling that flutter in your chest, that specific kind of anticipation that only builds when you know a cruel woman is about to get exactly what she deserves, do me a small favor and hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this story reach more people who need to hear it. Now, let's continue. When Claire de Lune ended, Raphael did something he had not done at a public event in nearly a decade. He walked, alone, without security, across the entire ballroom toward the piano. Guests parted before him instinctively, the way water parts around a stone dropped into a still pool. He stopped a respectful 3 feet from the dais, waited until Rosie's fingers had lifted from the keys, and spoke. "Signorina, may I make a request?" Rosie turned, and for one single, suspended heartbeat, the world narrowed to a pinpoint. She did not recognize him. She had no idea who he was. She saw only a tall man in an expensive suit with dark, patient eyes and a voice that carried the faintest trace of an Italian accent smoothed by generations of American schooling. She swallowed. "Of course, sir. What would you like to hear?" He tilted his head slightly. "Do you know Chopin's Nocturne in C-sharp minor? The posthumous one. Not the popular version. The one my grandmother used to hum when she was worried." Rosie's breath caught. It was not a famous piece. It was not a request she had ever received in 6 years of playing background music at events like this. It was the piece she had played at her Juilliard audition. She nodded once, turned back to the keys, and began to play. Raphael did not return to his corner. He remained standing 3 feet from the dais, hands clasped loosely behind his back, watching her hands, watching her face, watching the way her whole body leaned into the music, as if the piano were the only honest thing she had touched in years. When she finished, he inclined his head. "Thank you, Signorina. That was the most beautiful thing I have heard in a very long time." He reached into his interior jacket pocket, produced a folded $100 bill, and placed it gently in her tip jar. Then he turned and walked back into the crowd without another word. Rosie stared after him, her cheeks warm, her hands trembling slightly on the keys. She did not know his name. She did not need to. Something in the way he had listened had cracked open a door inside her chest that she had kept locked for 3 years. Across the ballroom, Celeste Ashford Vance saw the entire exchange, and something inside her went cold and sharp and murderous. Celeste was 28 years old, 5'9", blonde as harvested wheat, and had been groomed since birth to marry into precisely the kind of power that Raphael DeLuca represented. Her family's shipping empire, Ashford Maritime, moved 40% of the imported wine consumed on the eastern seaboard. She was engaged, technically, to Sutton Whitfield III, the junior senator from Connecticut's son, but the engagement had been arranged by their fathers, and both parties considered it a placeholder until better options materialized. Celeste had been circling Raphael DeLuca for 3 years. She had positioned herself at 4 separate charity events he was known to attend. She had cultivated a friendship with his cousin's wife specifically to gain proximity. She had spent a small fortune on Pilates and Portuguese lessons because she had heard, from an unreliable source, that he preferred women who spoke Romance languages. And in 3 years of calculated pursuit, Raphael DeLuca had never once looked at her the way he had just looked, for 4 solid minutes, at a plus-size pianist in a plum-colored dress from a consignment shop. Celeste turned to her 2 closest friends, Blair Sutherland and Miranda Cho, both size 2, both bored, both hungry for cruelty the way certain women are hungry for calories they will not allow themselves to consume. "We are handling this," Celeste said quietly, "right now." The 3 women crossed the ballroom in a tight formation, champagne flutes held like scepters, and arranged themselves in a loose semicircle around the piano. Rosie, in the middle of a soft rendition of Satie's Gymno Petit No. 1, felt their presence before she saw them. Celeste spoke first, loud enough that the nearest cluster of guests, perhaps 15 people, could hear every word. "Oh, sweetie, you play so well. It's just so brave of you to sit up there in that dress. I could never. I mean, the lighting up there is really unforgiving, you know." Blair sipped her champagne. "It's honestly inspiring. Body positivity is having such a moment right now." Miranda, phone already angled discreetly at chest height, added, "Do you take requests? Can you play something from The Little Mermaid? Ursula, maybe." The 3 of them laughed, a bright, practiced, cruel laugh that traveled across the marble floor and reached exactly the corner of the ballroom, where Raphael DeLuca was standing with a glass of untouched Macallan in his hand. He heard every word. Rosie's fingers did not stop. She kept playing Satie, note by patient note, her face carefully arranged into the polite neutrality that women who look like her learn to wear before they turn 15. But her vision blurred at the edges. A single tear formed at the corner of her right eye, hung there, and then fell onto the D-sharp key. It rolled slowly between the ivories. Celeste saw it. Celeste smiled. And then Celeste, misreading the room the way arrogant people always do, decided to press her advantage. She turned, scanned the crowd until she located Raphael, and raised her voice deliberately so that the words would carry. "Oh, Rafe, darling," she called across the ballroom, arm extended, a laugh in her throat like a bell. "Please tell me you weren't actually looking at her a moment ago. She's not your type. Look at her. She's the entertainment, not a guest." The ballroom did not gasp. Ballrooms like the Astoria Grand do not gasp. What happened instead was worse. 300 conversations paused simultaneously, the way a flock of birds turns as one body without any visible signal. And every face in the room turned first toward Celeste, then toward Raphael, then toward the woman at the piano who had just been publicly diminished in front of the most powerful room in Manhattan. Miranda's phone, still recording, tilted upward. Blair covered her mouth with her hand, either to hide a smile or to perform shock. It was impossible to tell. And Raphael DeLuca, standing very still in the corner with a glass of untouched Macallan in his hand, slowly, deliberately, set the glass down on a passing waiter's tray. His face did not change. His posture did not shift. But Marco Ricci, standing 2 feet behind him, exhaled a single quiet breath and murmured in Italian to Sal Greco, "Dio mio." She has no idea what she just did, because Raphael DeLuca had just made a decision. And when Raphael DeLuca made a decision, the consequences did not arrive as suggestions. They arrived as verdicts. If your heart is pounding right now, if you are already picturing the exact expression that is about to appear on Celeste's face, comment the word Queen below, so I know you're with me for what comes next. Because Raphael is about to walk across that ballroom. And by the time he reaches that piano, the entire social order of Manhattan is going to be rewritten in front of 300 witnesses. Raphael DeLuca began to walk. He did not hurry. He did not stride. He moved across the Carrara marble with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never in his adult life needed to rush toward anything, because the world had a habit of arranging itself around his arrival. The orchestra, sensing something without understanding it, let their current piece dwindle into silence. The waiters stopped moving. 300 faces tracked him across the ballroom, and not a single conversation dared resume. Celeste, still smiling, still holding her champagne flute at a triumphant angle, watched him approach and mistook his direction. She adjusted her posture, angled her hip, prepared the exact tilt of her chin she had practiced in mirrors since she was 16. Raphael walked past her as if she were a piece of furniture. He did not slow. He did not glance. The wake of his cologne, something dark and expensive with notes of bergamot and smoke, brushed against her bare shoulder and kept moving. Celeste's smile faltered for the first time. Blair, beside her, went very still. Miranda's phone, still recording, tilted downward as her hand began to shake. Raphael reached the raised dais and stopped exactly 3 feet from the piano bench, the same respectful distance he had maintained during his first request. Rosie's hands were frozen above the keys. She had not played a note since Celeste's voice had carried across the room. She was staring at the ivories, at the small wet marker Tier had left on the D-sharp, and she was counting her breaths the way her grandmother had taught her to do when the world became too loud. In through the nose for 4, hold for 4, out through the mouth for 6. She was on her 3rd cycle when Raphael spoke, and his voice, low and warm and pitched to carry to every corner of the ballroom, cut through her counting like a hand extended into deep water. Signorina Marchetti. She looked up. His eyes were on hers, and they were not the eyes of the polite stranger who had requested Chopin. They were the eyes of a man who had made a decision and was now simply waiting for her to accept it. Would you do me the very great honor of the next dance? The ballroom did not breathe. Rosie's lips parted. She glanced past him, saw 300 faces staring, saw Celeste standing frozen with her champagne flute tilted at a slight angle, as though she had forgotten she was holding it, saw the event coordinator Prudence in the wings with her mouth open in an expression that would have been comedic under any other circumstances. Rosie looked back at Raphael. Sir, I'm working. I'm not supposed to. You are not working anymore, Signorina. His voice remained perfectly gentle, but the sentence landed on the marble floor with the weight of a signed contract. You are the guest of the DeLuca family for the remainder of the evening. Prudence, is that a problem? He did not turn his head. He simply spoke Prudence's name into the air, and Prudence, from 30 feet away, produced a strangled sound that vaguely resembled the word no. Raphael extended his hand, palm up. It was not a demand. It was an invitation offered by a man who had never in his life had an invitation refused, and who would nonetheless wait patiently, forever, if she chose to make him. Rosie looked at the hand. She looked at his face. And then, slowly, with the deliberate care of a woman placing something valuable into safekeeping, she placed her hand in his. The orchestra, taking a cue from Marco Ricci's almost imperceptible nod, began to play a slow waltz. Raphael led Rosie down from the dais, one hand at the small of her back, the other still holding hers, and he guided her to the exact geographic center of the ballroom, the position historically reserved for the guests of honor. 300 people watched. Nobody spoke. Raphael turned Rosie into the first steps of the waltz, and she followed him without stumbling, because Juilliard scholarship students had been required to take 3 semesters of formal ballroom dance, and her body remembered even when her mind did not. She danced with a plus-size pianist grace, which is to say she danced with the unself-conscious authority of a woman who had spent a lifetime being told she should not, and had learned instead that she absolutely could. Raphael's hand at her back was warm. His eyes did not leave her face. When they had completed one full rotation, he spoke, quietly, meant only for her. "Breathe, Signorina. You are doing beautifully." People are staring. They are staring because they have finally, for the first time in this room's history, noticed something worth looking at. She laughed, a small startled sound, and he smiled, and Marco Ricci, from the edge of the dance floor, quietly texted Sal Greco a single word in Italian that translated approximately to "Fortress Fallen." Then, at the end of the second rotation, when they had reached the point on the ballroom floor closest to where Celeste Ashford Vance was standing frozen with her champagne flute, Raphael did something that was witnessed by 300 people, recorded by 17 phones, and reported in 6 separate gossip columns before dawn. He stopped dancing. He kept Rosie's hand in his. He turned his head, slowly, deliberately, until his dark eyes locked onto Celeste's face from a distance of perhaps 8 feet. And then he spoke, in a voice pitched to carry to the farthest corner of the marble floor. "Miss Ashford Vance, since you took the liberty of announcing my preferences to the room a few moments ago, permit me to correct the record." Celeste's mouth opened. No sound emerged. "My type," Raphael continued, his voice conversational, almost pleasant, "is intelligence. My type is dignity. My type is a woman who plays Chopin's posthumous nocturne from memory because she loves the piece, not because she was told it would impress. My type is a woman who is kind to waiters even when she thinks nobody is watching. My type, in summary, is the woman currently holding my hand. Which means, Miss Ashford Vance, that you were never, at any point in your entire calculated pursuit of me over the past 3 years, even in the running. I hope this clarifies matters." The ballroom did not gasp. The ballroom detonated. Somewhere near the ice sculpture, a woman actually dropped a champagne flute, and the sound of the crystal shattering on the marble was the only sound in the room for a full 3 seconds. Celeste's face went through 4 distinct colors. Miranda's phone, still recording, was already being subtly extracted from her hand by Sal Greco, who had appeared behind her with the silent efficiency of a man who moved through crowds the way sharks move through kelp. He removed the phone, smiled at Miranda with a warmth that did not reach his eyes, and murmured, "I will return this. Eventually, perhaps." Raphael returned his attention to Rosie, who was staring up at him with an expression that hovered between shock and something else, something that looked dangerously like awe. He lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. It was not a grand gesture. It was almost old-fashioned. It landed in that ballroom like a coronation. Then he turned to the room at large. For the record, and I would prefer to say this only once, Signorina Rosalind Marchetti is under the protection of the De Luca family, effective this evening. Any discourtesy directed toward her, in this room or outside of it, in person or in the press, in professional contexts or personal ones, will be understood as a discourtesy directed toward me. I trust the guests of the Ashford Foundation are intelligent enough to understand what that means. He paused. I would suggest everyone in this room commit her name to memory. He offered Rosie his arm. She took it, and Raphael De Luca walked Rosalind Marchetti out of the Astoria Grand Ballroom, while 300 of Manhattan's most powerful people watched in complete, stunned silence, and Celeste Ashford Vance's champagne flute finally slipped from her fingers and shattered against the marble at her feet. If you just felt that specific shiver run down your spine, that pure, uncomplicated satisfaction of watching a cruel woman finally, publicly, undeniably lose, then hit that subscribe button right now. Because what happens over the next 2 weeks is going to be even more satisfying than what just happened in that ballroom. In the back of the armored Bentley heading south along Park Avenue, Raphael did not touch her. He did not sit closer than the seat required. He handed her a glass of sparkling water because he had noticed, during the 2 brief interactions of the evening, that she had not touched champagne. He asked, quietly, where she lived. She told him, Astoria, Queens. A 3rd-floor walk-up above a Greek bakery. He nodded and gave the driver an address. Then he turned to her and said, Signorina, I owe you an explanation, and I suspect an apology. For what? For placing you at the center of an evening you did not ask to be placed at the center of. I made a decision without consulting you. It was not entirely fair. Rosie looked at him. The city lights slid across his face in soft golden bands. She was still wearing the plum-colored dress from the consignment shop. Her hair had come slightly loose from its chignon. She was still, technically, at work. And yet, sitting in the back of this car with this man, she felt more visible, more seen, more entirely herself than she had felt in 3 years. You didn't ask, no, she said quietly. But I didn't say no either. He smiled, and it was the first true smile she had seen on his face all evening, and it changed him completely. May I ask you something, Signorina? You may. Why did you keep playing? When she said what she said, you did not stop. You did not react. You kept playing Sati, as if the piece mattered more than the insult. Why? Rosie was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, because my grandmother used to tell me that cruelty is a stone thrown into a river, and the river does not stop flowing because someone threw a stone. It just carries the stone downstream and keeps moving. Raphael did not respond immediately. When he did, his voice was rougher than it had been all evening. Your grandmother was a wise woman. She was. She was also the daughter of a seamstress in a small village in Calabria. She married a longshoreman. She raised 4 children in a 2-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn. And she told me, until the day she died, that dignity was the one thing nobody could take from me unless I handed it to them. Raphael turned his head fully toward her then, and what he said next, in Italian, in the specific dialect of southern Calabria, was, then you and I were raised by the same woman, in different centuries. Rosie's breath caught. She answered him in the same dialect, perhaps we were. And Raphael DeLuca, the most feared man in New York, laughed out loud in the back of an armored Bentley for the first time in a decade. He walked her to her door. He did not ask to come inside. At the base of the walk-up, beneath the flickering yellow porch light, he reached into his interior jacket pocket and produced a small black embossed business card. It bore no name, no title, no logo, just a single phone number, and on the reverse, in sharp black fountain pen ink, one handwritten sentence. When you are ready to stop playing for other people's parties, call me. He handed it to her. He inclined his head. He turned, walked back to the Bentley, and disappeared into the New York night. Rosie stood on the front stoop of her building, holding the card in her fingers, and did not move for a very long time. What happened over the next 14 days did not appear in any newspaper, but it was felt in every corner of Manhattan's overlapping social ecosystems. Within 48 hours, Ashford Maritime lost 3 of its largest shipping contracts. The buyers, all of whom happened to be owned through discrete layers of holding companies by entities that traced back to the DeLuca family trust, cited unspecified operational concerns. Celeste's father, Wallace Ashford Vance, spent an entire afternoon on the phone attempting to reach anyone in a position to reverse the decisions. Nobody returned his calls. On the 4th day, Miranda Cho's phone, which had been quietly returned to her home doorman in a padded envelope, had somehow become entirely wiped of contents, except for a single message on her lock screen that read, in elegant script, "Be kinder. Someone is always watching." 2 days after that, a compilation video of Miranda mocking 3 separate service workers over the past year, filmed by her own phone at parties she had attended, appeared on the private Instagram accounts of every major public relations firm in New York. Miranda's employment at Ogilvy was terminated on a Thursday. On the 7th day, Blair Sutherland's brand sponsorship deals, which had provided her with roughly $400,000 annually in exchange for photographs of her holding various luxury products, began to evaporate. La Mer went first, then Dior. Then, in a coordinated announcement that seemed almost choreographed, 7 additional brands quietly declined to renew. On the 9th day, Sutton Whitfield III, the senator's son, who was technically engaged to Celeste, announced, via his family's press office, that the engagement had been amicably dissolved by mutual agreement. 3 weeks later, Sutton was photographed at a Yankees game with a civil rights attorney named Isabella Herrera, a woman whose Instagram bio described her accurately as a proud daughter of Dominican immigrants. The tabloid coverage of the new relationship was, by every metric, adoring. The tabloid coverage of Celeste's disappearance from the social calendar was total. By the 14th day, Celeste Ashford Vance was on a private plane to her family's Palm Beach compound, where she would remain, effectively exiled from Manhattan society, for the foreseeable future. Her father, over a very stiff scotch on the veranda, told her precisely what he thought of her. "You made an enemy of Raphael De Luca," Wallace said, without raising his voice, over a piano player. "You detonated 3 generations of this family's carefully cultivated reputation over your own vanity. I did not raise a fool, Celeste, which means somewhere along the way I stopped raising you at all. That is my failure, but the consequences will be yours." Celeste did not respond. There was nothing to say. On the 16th day, Rosalind Marchetti called the number on the black embossed card. 6 months later, on a cold evening in early December, she stepped out of a chauffeured car in front of the Metropolitan Museum of Art wearing a custom sapphire blue gown designed for her by a couturier whose waiting list was now 3 years long. She had returned to Juilliard. She was the inaugural recipient of the Sofia De Luca Memorial Scholarship, an endowment established in the name of Raphael's late mother that would fund the full education of one promising pianist annually, in perpetuity. Her mother's memory care was fully covered. Her brother Danny had received the new communication device and 3 additional pieces of adaptive technology that had transformed his daily life. Rosie's father's remaining gambling debts had been quietly settled through channels she did not entirely understand and had chosen not to investigate. She had been photographed for Vogue's Rising Voices feature, and she was, this evening, the opening performer at the Metropolitan Museum's annual winter benefit, the same rung of Manhattan society that had spent 6 months whispering about her in equal parts fascination and fear. Raphael walked beside her. The ballroom, when they entered, parted the way had always parted for him alone. This time, it also parted for her. Before she performed, she spoke briefly into the microphone, her hands folded in front of her sapphire gown. "I was told once, in a ballroom very much like this one, that I was not someone's type. I would like to thank the woman who said it publicly and cruelly, in front of 300 witnesses. Because she taught me the most important lesson of my adult life. The people who try to define your worth are almost always the ones who have none of their own. And the only correct response to their cruelty is to keep playing." Then she sat down at the piano, and she played Chopin's Nocturne in C-sharp minor, posthumous, the piece Raphael's grandmother had hummed when she was worried, the piece Rosie had once played at a Juilliard audition she had believed for 3 years she had wasted. When she finished, the entire ballroom rose to its feet. Raphael, in the front row, did not clap. He simply watched her, the way he had watched her the first night, with the still, absolute attention of a man who had found the only thing in his life he had ever considered irreplaceable. Backstage, he pressed a small velvet box into her palm. Inside was a delicate gold key. She looked up at him, questioning. He kissed her forehead. "They said you were not my type, Rosalind. They were right. You are not my type. You are my exception. My only one. So tell me, what did you think? Did Celeste get exactly what she deserved, or should Raphael have gone even further? Would you have handled that ballroom the way Rosalind did, keeping your hands on the keys and letting the tear fall onto the ivory? Or would you have stood up and thrown the piano bench across the marble floor? Drop your answer in the comments below, because I read every single one. If this story moved you, if you felt that flutter when Raphael crossed the ballroom, if you cheered when Rosie sat down at the Metropolitan piano 6 months later, please smash that like button. Share this story with a woman in your life who has ever been told she was not somebody's type. And hit subscribe for more stories of quiet women who were underestimated by loud rooms until the loud rooms finally, painfully, learned better. Because the strongest women in the world are almost never the loudest ones. They are the ones who keep playing while the stones fall into the river, and who understand that the river, in the end, always wins.